Yes, Counsel. Good morning.
Good morning. May it please the Court, my name is Richard Burke. I'm representing the Bristol County Mosquito Control Project in this matter. In this matter, the project sought a declaration in the Superior Court below on two matters. First, that it had the sole authority under the Legislative Act, Chapter 252, Section 14D, to set the salaries of its employees. And secondly, that it had the authority to hire and retain legal counsel to assert and protect its rights and interests under the statute.
So how does this work? If the project, your clients, if the commissioners say, we're going to pay these people X dollars for salary, do they then report that to the board, the state board, and the board has to come up with a budget that includes that money? Or what if the board doesn't want to include that money? And they say, no, you're going to have to work within a certain budget.
Well,
What gives? I mean, where is the give?
I think there are two things. I guess in answer to your question, Your Honor, yes, the project does come up with a budget, and it does submit that budget to the board. Historically, in Section 12 of Chapter 252, there was reference that the project may employ individuals to carry out its functions. There really was not much reference to employment or salaries or personnel other than that. Section 14D, we submit, Your Honor, was meant to address that by saying that with respect to employees, it's the legislature's intention that these local projects have the authority to set the salaries of their employees. The rest of the statute talks about making improvements, doing projects of that nature. And I think that there is a balance between the two, that the board certainly would have authority under the overall statute to look at what type of improvements do you want to do, what is that going to cost. But what the legislature is saying is that when we formulate these budgets, that there really are two parts here. And the part that pertains to salaries, that the board is obligated to permit the projects to set the salaries.
So, well, does that mean that the project could, let's just hypothetically say, you know, here's, in this situation, we're going to pay this person 5 times as much as anyone else because we think let me pick an unreasonable amount of money. We're going to pay them $500,000. Could they do that?
I think they couldn't, Your Honor, and I think first I would...
Why couldn't they, since they're setting the salary?
I think that the statute, Section 14D, has a standard built in, and that standard is the establishment of rates of compensation for personnel representative of the regional economy. The board, the project and its commissioners have fiduciary obligations. I think first, Your Honor, is that wasn't what was going on here. What was happening was actually the opposite of that, is that in Bristol County, the commissioners determined that their employees were being paid much less than other project employees in other counties around the state. And they...
Is there any record to that effect?
Yeah.
Excuse me. I didn't see anything in the record except a blank statement that we were equalizing salaries.
There is a, we did include in the record, Your Honor, salaries at the time of other counties and what comparable employees were receiving.
Okay, I did not see that. Could you give me a record, or could you send us a record site?
It was cited in the brief, Your Honor. Let me see if I can.
So that was plainly, in other words, presented to the board. Here's what we're trying, here the project, the commissioners say, here's what we're trying to do. Here are the salaries in, I don't know, Middlesex or Berkshire, and this is how we're trying to equalize them. I think that was presented to the board?
I don't know whether the documents in the record in terms of, it was attached to an affidavit of one of the commissioners that was before the court on summary judgment, showing what other counties were paying their comparable employees, but certainly the commissioners told the board why their justification for wanting the salary increases was to level the compensation to what other communities were paying. They were, in fact, afraid, Your Honor, that they would be losing employees and that they wouldn't be able to retain entomologists and appropriate professionals.
So let me go back to Justice Spina's question on how this is supposed to work. On the one hand, would you agree that the statute, that the board is the entity that has authority to determine the amount necessary during any fiscal year for expenditures on behalf of said district? That's what the board is supposed to do, determine the amount necessary for expenditures on behalf of said district.
I think there is a conflict in the statute in that regard, and especially with the recent amendment that was passed by the legislature in 2013. I think that with regard to the salary part of the budget, that the legislature has clearly stated that that should be determined in the local communities, in the local project areas.
So that's not part of what the board can consider when determining what the amount necessary is for the project?
I think the board is obligated to accept the salary structures that are set by the local projects.
Do you include in that as well the salaries for the commissioners?
No, the commissioners are paid a nominal sum under the statute, Your Honor, and what the Bristol County project was concerned about was its employees, its superintendent, its assistant superintendent, its clerical worker, and its entomologist.
So when the legislature in 14D is talking about personnel, I mean, I see that Section 5 specifically mentions salaries for the commissioners, and I was wondering how those two work together there.
We're not talking about the commissioners here, I don't believe, Your Honor, with 14D. I think 14D, what that is talking about is the hiring of personnel, the personnel under Section 12 that work for the projects. Section 12 of the chapter refers to the project commissioners having the authority to hire personnel to carry out the functions. In fact, they're employed by the commissioners. That's the wording, the way I read the wording of Section 12. And what, in 14D, what the legislature is addressing is this conflict that had arisen between the board and the project as to who has that authority and whether the salaries should be set in that part of the budget should be set by direction of the local projects.
Can I just ask a question here? It's not clear to me what power the board has with respect to the budget. Now, presumably, the project comes up with an itemized budget, and here it included these proposed salaries. Did the board disapprove the entire budget, or did it disapprove only the salary component of?
I believe what we were talking about here was only the salary component, Your
So the
Honor.
budget otherwise was approved?
Budget, there was an operating budget and there were trust funds that were available that had funds set apart for the Bristol County project. And what the Bristol County project was trying to do was, in one particular instance, to raise not the overall budget, but just the salaries of its employees. And it had sufficient funds set aside in the trust fund at the time to do that, and it had voted to raise those salaries both before Section 14D was enacted and after.
Right, but I guess the question is, so did it exceed the budget?
No, I believe the record would reflect, Your Honor, that there was sufficient budget set aside in these trust funds at the time that there was not an issue of a lack of monies to meet the salary requirements. It was simply a power struggle between the board and the project as to who would be able to determine this, and the board simply saying, we don't recognize it at all. They put a moratorium initially, and then...
But did the board disapprove the entire budget, or just this line item?
Just this line item.
Just this line item, and because I'm curious to know what you think about the impact, if any, of the recent legislation, which apparently does not give the board the authority to modify the budget approved by a mosquito control project without the mosquito control project's approval. the Attorney General says that it makes no difference to this case because it's, here, what happened was the board had the power to approve or disapprove a project's overall budget. And so I'm puzzled here about what actually happened. Did the board disapprove the overall budget, or did it just disapprove a line item having to do with
The
salary?
only issue in the record was the line item. There's correspondence back and forth between the project and the board specifically about salaries, and that was the issue that gave rise to the controversy below that led to the filing of the case in the Superior Court. With regard to the recent 2013 amendment, I would submit, Your Honor, that that's just further evidence, indication of the intent of the legislature, that what the legislature wants is to have, with respect to salaries and compensation, to have that determined by the local projects and not set by the board.
But what do you say is the authority of the board with respect to the budget? Do they have a line item control, or control over line items, or is it just a gross overall management, overall oversight of the budget?
I think other than salaries, other types of projects and investments in real estate and development of real estate, that with respect to that, Your Honor, that seems to be still within the oversight of the board. And what the legislature is talking about is the salaries, and that is something that should be set locally within the projects.
So I'm just, I don't totally understand cherry sheets, but help me out. You set a budget that somebody tells the local participating municipalities, you need to assess up to 15 cents for every $1,000 of valuation or something like that for this, is that right?
Well, that was in the original Enabling Act of the
Yeah.
Bristol County project, and that's been changed now, Your Honor, and in Chapter 252, Section 5A, the language, I believe, that applies, it just simply says, the state treasurer shall assess the members of any mosquito control district up to 100% of the amount determined by the board to be necessary during any fiscal year
Okay.
for expenditures.
So the board says, and when does that happen in the course of a year?
I believe it happens prior to the beginning of the state budgetary cycle, is my understanding, Your Honor.
So the board says Bristol needs $1 million. And the assessment's done, and then in the meantime, the commissioners raise the salary of the entomologist, et cetera, and so now it's not $1 million, but it's $1.5 million. Who pays that?
Well,
Where does that come from?
when this controversy arose, there was a surplus of funds in a trust fund that was set aside for Bristol County from prior years.
Okay.
And what happened was the commissioners voted to increase the salaries. That was it. They were operating under a pre-approved
But
budget.
theoretically, there may not have been. So what happens then?
Well, as we go into a new budgetary cycle, what the recent amendment and what 14D are saying to me is that the Bristol County commissioners would vote to establish and determine the salary part of the budget. They would submit that to the board. The board would have to accept that and would have the ability to approve other parts of the budget, such as improvements, as referenced in the statute. And then whatever that budget is, what 252-5A is saying is that the state treasurer must assess that amount. So there will never be a problem. In this case, it arose earlier on because there was a surplus of funds. It was of concern to the board, and they were looking to just really do one thing, which was to raise the salaries. And that's where the pushing and shoving started, and then it led to 14D being passed, and still the board, even after the commissioners voted again, not accepting that.
So if the board says, no, we can't afford $1.5 million, we can only afford $1.1 million, and we approve a budget of $1.1 million, Are you saying that, that what suffers is the improvements are diminished?
I think that once the budget is approved, that by the statute, the state treasurer is obligated to assess the communities as part of what they're receiving from the state in local aid.
So their proportionate share of the $1.1 million budget?
Yes, Your Honor.
And then the mosquito control would engage in diminished services, but at the higher salaries? I mean, that's the way it works, in your view.
I think I'm saying something different, Your Honor. What I'm saying is that there is a process in the forming of a budget. There is a salary component. There are other parts of the budget. Once the budget is approved, it is assessed, and there's a balancing there. There isn't a deficit. Obviously, the higher the budget, the more money there is to spend, but what the Bristol County Commissioners are trying to have done is to have the authority to set the salary part of the budget here, which the board has not recognized their authority to do.
But when you say once the budget is approved, do you mean by the district or by the reclamation board?
I think that the two parties are obligated and have different statutory rights to work together. The commissioners from the project set the salary component, and then they have to work with the board to set the rest of the budget. But once a budget is established, it's determined that amount is collected from the cherry sheet, so there won't be an imbalance, if that was Your Honor's question.
So the bottom line is, your position is that the board is stuck with whatever salary the project comes up with and sets. They're stuck with it, aren't they?
Yes, Your Honor. They have to accept it. They cannot. They have to accept what the project votes. That's what 14D says, and I think that's the purpose of the recent statutory amendment.
But could they just disapprove the entire budget?
I think that would be problematic because I suppose that they could, Your Honor, but we have a special act of the legislature creating the Bristol County project to do a certain function.
But subject to the board's supervision. And if the board has the authority to approve or disapprove the budget as a whole, and there's a component of it, they don't have a line item veto, as it were, but they could simply say, on the whole, this is not a satisfactory budget.
I think if they did that, they would be failing to fulfill the special act of the legislature which created the Bristol County District and gave it a function, which is protecting Bristol County from mosquito problems.
But why wouldn't it be reasonable to read the statute in such a way that the board would set the budget, and then you would hire your staff, the project would hire its staff, and set the salaries within the limits of the budget?
Well, the specific problem arose here is that the board was rejecting the salaries that the Bristol County Commissioners wanted to set. So they were not allowing them to do that, Your Honor. I guess on your scenario, that would work if the board agreed and accepted the salaries that Bristol County wanted to do.
Well, what you're saying is that the board agreed on whatever the number was for the project with the salaries included.
Well, they never, the particular problem arose here, Your Honor, where a budget was set, and then during the course of that budget year, the Bristol County Commissioners voted to increase the salaries, knowing that they had these other trust funds, set aside, and the board refused to allow them to do that, and then continues to refuse to recognize their authority to do that. So it is a question of who has that statutory authority.
All right, thank you, Mr. Burke.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Good morning, and may it please the court. My name is Amy Spector. I'm an Assistant Attorney General, and I represent the State Reclamation and Mosquito Control Board and the Treasurer.
Can I ask this? The sole authority to set compensation certainly means something.
It certainly does, Your Honor. Our position is that language does mean something, but that it has to be read in conjunction with the rest of Chapter 252. And I just want to start off by directing the court's attention to some of the critical portions of the statute that underscore the extent of oversight that the board has, in particular over budgetary matters. Section 5A, which provides that the assessment amount is, the amount of expenditures are as determined as necessary by the board. The board has to annually certify to the comptroller that the project's expenditures don't exceed related assessments. The project is required to submit vouchers for its expenses to the board. This is in section 14. The board must inspect them and forward them for, if it approves them, must forward them for payment by the treasurer. Section 12 of the statute, which provides that the board shall carry out its improvements in such manner, the project shall carry out its improvements in such manner as the board may approve. And finally, the board's enabling legislation, which provides that the project shall expend funds for mosquito control under the board's direction and supervision. So we certainly do think that 14D has meaning, and to give it meaning and to harmonize it with these various other sections, what we believe the correct answer is what the Superior Court found, namely...
I'm trying to figure out what the Superior Court means, so go explain that to me.
I think what the Superior Court meant, and certainly the way that we think that these various provisions can be harmonized, and I don't pretend to argue that the statute is clear. It's unfortunately not. But I think that the way that it can be sensibly harmonized is that within the limits of an overall budget, approved by the board, the local projects do have the authority to set the specific salary amounts of its employees.
But then, I mean, we're dealing here with what did the legislature mean, aren't we? I mean, looking at the larger statute and the smaller ones?
Yes, we are.
And you've got now two statutes, 14D and then the 2013 amendment, which seem to me to be, I mean, it's hard not to read into them. I haven't done any legislative history and I don't really see any in these materials, but it seems to me hard not to see those specific provisions as suggesting that the salary of these, that the budget itself is going to be something that the mosquito control project or district has a right to do without interference of the board, and that the salaries under 14D are something, the compensation is something that the district has. So if you're I understand your argument. It makes a lot of sense if you had, as a sort of theoretical matter, can you harmonize these things? But the way that this has passed just seems to me hard to justify, or to, I'm just having trouble.
No,
with
I
that.
understand Your Honor's question. I think, though, I think what's really critical here is that had the legislature meant to strip the board of all authority, surely it could have done so and would have done so explicitly. Rather, it seems to have tacked on a section which, to be sure, does give the local projects some authority. We're not arguing with that. But the legislature did not touch any of these other provisions. Again, the provision that requires the board to determine what expenditures are necessary, that requires the board to inspect the vouchers submitted by the project and forward them, if it approves them, to the treasurer, that provides that the board must annually certify to the comptroller that the expenditures do not exceed related assessments, and so forth. Had the legislature really intended to displace the board's authority completely, it certainly would have done so
If we
more
agree with your
expressly.
brother, what's left for the board to do?
Well, I think that would be a serious problem in terms of the heart of the statute, which is a public health and the effective, achievement of mosquito control at a reasonable cost that the towns can viably pay for. I mean, the contention that the appellants have made that the towns can always withdraw from the project if they don't like the assessment amount is really contrary to the public health objective in the statute. I do want to address what I think might be an area of where we have characterized things a bit differently. Here, the salary increases were not made as part of the annual budget. There's not, unfortunately, a lot in the record that sheds light on this other than the timing of the increases, of the request for increases, which does make clear. The project requested these increases initially in December of 2007 and later resubmitted the request in December 2008. So they were in fact not part of an annual budget request.
And
It
where
is-
does the board's authority to do anything with those come from?
Well,
I mean, because
The
you
problem-
yourself have said that the board has the power to approve or disapprove the project's overall budget, and not on a piecemeal, item by item, line item by line item basis. That's not the board's power.
that's right. We
So,
think,
so where's the board's power to say, as to a particular line item having to do with salaries that you say were not submitted as part of the budget, to do anything with respect to that?
well, I think I think as a practical matter, what has sometimes happened is that in the middle of a fiscal year, a project has had extra funds in some account, for example, their pesticide account or their equipment account, and they have asked for a small increase. The board, in those situations could address those as they come up, but here what happened is the board asked for justification for the increase, including that it could be absorbed within the annual budget. They didn't get that. Information was not forthcoming, reasonably leading the board to infer here that the increases would put them over the budget. So this was
Anything in the record that establishes one way or the other whether or not the salary increases would have exceeded the project's budget?
Unfortunately, the record does not establish that. What it establishes is that the board asked for justification, including in one of the two places, I think it was pages 74 and 75, and then 82 and 133 in the appendix, where the board was requesting that the project submit justification, including that the amounts could be absorbed within the annual budget that had already been approved for the fiscal year.
But would that, if the answer had been, well, no, but we have these extra funds set aside for Bristol, number one, but two, could the project have said, okay, we won't do it until July 1 of the next year, and so the budget for that year we're going to ask for it to be increased to cover that. Could they do that?
Well, certainly they could have submitted. In fact, that would have, I think, been the manner consistent with the statute and with the respective obligations of the project and the board for the increases to be made as part of an annual budget request.
Prospectively?
Yes, prospectively. And then in that scenario, the board would have had the opportunity to evaluate the overall budget, which is its statutory role. But that would have been a very different situation, what happened here, which again, given the timing of the requests, is problematic because it appears certainly that, and again, there's nothing specifically in the record, but the timing of them and the fact that the project did not come back and answer the board's inquiry about whether they could be absorbed certainly could lead to the conclusion that the requests were going to exceed the budget for the year.
I'm still perplexed as to what you think the legislature was doing. I mean, they've twice passed legislation, and as far as I can tell, you say it has no consequence.
Well, I don't think it has no consequence. I think the legislature.
So what is the consequence? What the legislature has twice acted. What do we take from their legislation to be the consequence of their new laws?
I think the consequence is that, again, it's somewhat hard to discern because the statute looked at as a whole is hardly a model of clarity. But the legislature did seem to be concerned with conferring some authority on the projects, on the local projects, in terms of determining the specific salaries of
more
their
than some
employees.
authority, sole authority.
Sole authority to set the rates of compensation of particular employees. But again, had the legislature intended to eviscerate the board and to get rid of all of these other provisions, I think that it would have done so more explicitly,
Is
and
that
it
a
did
rule of
not.
statutory construction, that it can't also do it by death by 1,000 cuts?
Well, I think there are too many other places in the statute. Again, the fact that the board has this requirement that it has to certify to the comptroller that expenditures don't exceed assessments, that it has to determine which expenditures are necessary, and so forth.
Does it say,
There's
do
no
we know what
mention.
that means, which expenditures are necessary, as opposed to, of course, salaries are necessary. Does the board's authority have to be drawn so large as to say salaries in certain X amounts are necessary? I mean, does the board have a role to play in setting each of the line items as to whether that amount of money is necessary or whether the expenditures themselves are?
I think the board's role is to determine whether the overall expenditures are necessary, but as Your Honor pointed out, where the component parts, for example, although they seem to have distanced themselves here at this argument, the argument presented to the Superior Court was that, in fact, the project could decide to pay its employees the salary of, for example, a Tom Brady, a professional athlete. And so to the extent that that component part makes the salary as a whole clearly not aimed or necessary for effective mosquito control, that is something that the board asserts authority over.
Right, but there's a difference between, these extreme situations where the board could then take the position, presumably, we're not approving the budget.
Exactly.
My question is, why can't this be worked out? I mean, the board and the commissioners have to work together. Obviously, the statute intends that they work together to get these projects funded and accomplished. I just don't understand why this can't be worked out now that the legislature has made their views perfectly clear.
Well, I guess unfortunately, but the respective parties here don't share the same view of the statute. So they have been at loggerheads, throughout this litigation.
Is this issue coming up in other mosquito control projects or districts?
I'm not aware of it having come up. I know that other projects since the enactment of Section 14D have sought and gotten salary increases. So I think that this particular impasse, I believe, is limited to this project. In terms of
So as a practical, let's go practical, how this gets constructed. I know it's already been talked about a little bit. The project puts together its budget for the coming year, right? The commissioners,
yes,
is that right?
yes,
Submits it to the board.
yes.
The board has to decide whether these are necessary expenditures for the undertaking.
Yes, that's right. And I
And
believe
the board
that-
can't say, well, you're paying this person too much, you're paying that person too little. But if the overall budget seems out of proportion to what is necessary, I take it the board can then not approve the budget.
that is our position, yes. Yes.
Well, is that what the judge intended here?
I think that is what the Superior Court judge intended. In other words, to harmonize these provisions, the board retains authority, just as Your Honor suggested, to review, to approve or disapprove the overall budget, but not to tinker with the specific amounts. In the situation where the specific amounts are exorbitant, the board can say we are
Right.
disapproving it, and probably the reason will be obvious.
But that's not, that really hasn't been the nature of the discussion in the record. It's all about no raises because the state can't afford raises, period, no percentage, this percent. It seems to be very particular and not this broader process that you're describing.
Well, I think it's both. I mean, I think here, unfortunately, the record is a bit slim in terms of the specifics. What is clear, though, is that the board asked repeatedly for justification, and none was forthcoming. The material...
I thought justification was forthcoming, the equalization of salaries across projects.
That was the reason offered, but the only material in the record was actually an excerpt from an article from the Boston Herald, which in fact showed that the requested increase for the superintendent, if granted, would have exceeded the salary of 4 of the 5 other superintendents identified in this article.
But I guess what I'm having trouble with is where the board gets the authority to ask for justification for specific items, which under 14D are within the purview of the project.
I think the board, I think, was trying to ascertain, a number of things, including were the requested increases within the overall budget that had already been approved for that fiscal year. So,
So we don't really know on this record whether the board was or was not really acting within the scope of its authority, on this record.
I don't think that's true, Your Honor. I think that the board was, at a minimum, was seeking information to ascertain whether,
To the extent it was disapproving particular items, or the record can be viewed as it was disapproving certain items.
yes,
Where
but,
is the authority in the statute for the board to do that?
well, I think the board's overall authority is to determine whether expenditures are necessary, and it has to certify to the comptroller that expenditures will not exceed related assessments. In order to carry out that obligation, which it has under the statute, it certainly has to ensure that mid-year requested increases, which will put the project over budget, are not going to happen. That would be contrary, directly contrary to the board's statutory
Would
obligation.
the board actually disapprove these expenditures?
It didn't actually disapprove, it asked for more information, and which was not forthcoming. So in a way, what happened is that they never really got to a final decision, but they declined to approve the request based
So
on
they
the...
did make a decision, they declined to approve the request.
They declined to approve the request based on the information provided at the time.
Counsel, we have to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you.